There's a photograph somewhere in a basement in Ohio, buried under boxes that haven't been opened in 20 years. In it, two brothers stand shoulder to shoulder, grinning at the camera like they own the world. One of them would spend the rest of his life trying to prove he was smarter than the other. And it would cost him everything. His name was Martin Caldwell, though everyone in Cedar Ridge called him Marty. He was the kind of man who remembered every conversation, every slight, every moment someone doubted him. He kept a mental ledger of debts owed and respect denied, and he intended to settle every account before he died. His brother David was different. David let things roll off his shoulders like water off a duck's back. David laughed easily, forgave quickly, and never seemed to need anyone to tell him he was right. Which, if you knew Marty, made David the most infuriating person on earth. They grew up in a 2-story house on Maple Street, where their father ran a small accounting firm and their mother taught piano lessons in the front room. The sound of scales and arpeggios mixed with the smell of pot roast every Tuesday evening. It was the kind of childhood people write songs about, the kind that feels warm and golden when you look back on it. But memory is funny that way. It smooths over the rough edges, the moments that shaped you without your permission. Marty was older by 3 years, and he wore that crown like it meant something. He was the one who got straight A's, who won the science fair in 8th grade, and who got accepted to Cornell with a full scholarship. David was the one who barely scraped by in school, who spent his afternoons shooting hoops in the driveway, and who ended up at the state university studying something vague like communications. Their father would pat Marty on the back at dinner and say, "This one's going places." And David would just smile and reach for more potatoes, like it didn't cut him at all. But it did cut. It cut both of them, in different ways. The real trouble started with a piece of land. Isn't that always how it goes? A plot of earth that meant nothing to anyone until suddenly it meant everything. Their father passed away in the spring of 1987, unexpectedly and swiftly, the way a heart attack takes a man in his sleep. Their mother followed 18 months later, like she'd been holding on just long enough to see both sons through their grief. And in the will, among the modest savings and the paid-off mortgage, was a clause about the 15 acres their father had purchased back in 1965 on the outskirts of town. The land sat near where the new highway was planned. Everyone knew about the highway. It had been in the county plans for years. And everyone knew that land values along that corridor would triple, maybe quadruple, once construction began. The will said the land should be sold and the proceeds split evenly between the two sons. Simple, clean, fair. But Marty had a different idea. Marty had done research. He'd spent weeks at the county courthouse, poring over zoning maps and development proposals. He'd called lawyers and real estate agents and highway commission clerks. And he'd concluded, with absolute certainty, that they shouldn't sell. Not yet. If we wait 5 years, Marty told David over coffee at the diner on Main Street, we'll make 4 times what we make now. Maybe more. I've run the numbers, David. I've talked to people who know. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. David stirred his coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into the black. He was quiet for a long time, the way he got when he was thinking something through. Finally, he said, I need the money now, Marty. Sarah and I are buying a house. We've got the baby coming. I can't wait 5 years. The way Marty's face changed in that moment, you would have thought David had spit in his coffee. His jaw tightened, and his eyes went cold. You're making a mistake, he said. A huge mistake. And you're going to regret it. David shook his head gently. Maybe. But it's my decision to make with my half. And that's when Marty said the thing he could never take back. Your half? You didn't earn your half, David. Dad left us that land because of me. Because I'm the one who made something of myself. You've coasted your whole life. The silence that followed was the kind you can feel in your chest. David stood up, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out without another word. And Marty sat there, watching his brother's back disappear through the diner door, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not regret, not yet. Just a hollow victory, like winning an argument no one else wanted to have. They didn't speak for 6 months. Not at Christmas, not when David's daughter Emma was born, not when Marty's firm landed a major contract with a pharmaceutical company in Pittsburgh. Their mother's friends would ask at church, "How are your boys?" And the few people who knew the truth would change the subject. Cedar Ridge was small enough that everyone eventually heard about the brothers who stopped talking over a piece of land. David sold his half. He had to. He and Sarah needed the down payment, and there was a developer who was buying up parcels along the highway route, offering fair prices with quick closings. David walked away with $68,000, enough to buy a modest 3-bedroom house on Elm Street with a yard big enough for a swing set. He planted tomatoes that first summer, built a sandbox for Emma, and tried not to think about his brother. But at night, lying in bed with Sarah's head on his shoulder, he would wonder if Marty was right. If he made the biggest financial mistake of his life. If being practical was just another word for being afraid. Marty held on to his half of the land like a man clutching a winning lottery ticket. He watched the highway construction begin, watched the first exits get paved, and watched the gas stations and fast food restaurants start to appear. He'd been right. Of course he'd been right. The land was already worth more than what David had sold it for, and it was only going up. He called developers, fielded offers, and said no to every single one. Not yet, he'd tell them. Call me in 2 years. But something was happening that Marty hadn't planned for. The county changed the zoning laws. There were new environmental regulations about wetlands and new restrictions on commercial development. The exit that was supposed to be near their land got moved 3 miles south. The land was still valuable, just not as valuable as it was supposed to be. Not as valuable as Marty had promised himself it would be. And instead of selling, instead of taking his profit and moving on, Marty doubled down. He took out loans, purchased adjacent parcels, and convinced himself that he just needed to wait a little longer. Years passed like pages turning in a book no one was reading. David's life unfolded in the ordinary, beautiful way lives do when you're not trying to prove anything. Emma learned to ride a bike, Sarah got a promotion at the hospital, they took vacations to Lake Erie, and they bought a golden retriever named Biscuit. David would see Marty sometimes, across the parking lot at the grocery store or walking into the bank downtown. They'd nod, formal and distant, like acquaintances who'd once shared a table at a wedding. People would ask David, "Have you talked to your brother?" And he'd say, "Not really, no." And they'd shake their heads sadly, because everyone in Cedar Ridge remembered when the Caldwell boys were inseparable, when you couldn't see one without the other trailing behind. But David had made peace with it, or he told himself he had. He'd stopped waiting for Marty to call and stopped hoping for reconciliation. He focused on what was in front of him, his daughter's school plays, his wife's laughter in the kitchen, and the garden that bloomed bigger every summer. Marty's life looked different from the outside. He'd started his own consulting firm, specializing in land development and investment strategy. He had an office with his name on the door, a secretary who screened his calls, and business cards with embossed lettering. He drove a silver Mercedes, wore Italian shoes, and took clients to expensive steakhouses where the wine list was longer than the menu. But if you looked closer, if you paid attention to the tightness around his eyes or the way his hand shook slightly when he signed checks, you'd see something else. You'd see a man running on fumes, trying to maintain an image of success while the foundation crumbled underneath. The land deals weren't working out the way he'd projected. The market had shifted. The developers who'd been so eager 5 years ago had moved on to other projects. The loans he'd taken out had adjustable rates, and those rates had adjusted upward. Every month, the interest ate a little more of his savings. His wife, Patricia, would ask him over dinner, "Honey, are we okay? Financially, I mean?" And he'd wave her off with a confident smile and say, "We're fine. Better than fine. Just trust me." But trust is a finite resource. You can withdraw from it only so many times before the account runs dry. Patricia started noticing the late notices that arrived in the mail and the calls from unfamiliar numbers that Marty wouldn't answer in front of her. She'd grown up poor, had watched her own father lose their house during the recession of the 70s, and she recognized the signs. The forced optimism, the vague explanations, the promises that things were about to turn around. She'd married Marty because he seemed like the kind of man who had everything figured out. Now she wasn't sure what she'd married into. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in October, the kind of fall day when the air smells like wood smoke and dying leaves. Marty was in his office, reviewing projections that refused to project anything good, when his secretary buzzed through. "There's a David Caldwell on line 2. He says he's your brother." Marty stared at the blinking light on his phone for a full 30 seconds before picking up. His hand was steady, but his voice wasn't. "David." "Hey, Marty." David's voice sounded older, weathered by time and distance. "I know it's been a while. I'm calling because, well, Sarah thought I should. Emma's getting married in 3 weeks. She'd like you to come. Both of you, you and Patricia." The silence stretched between them like a rope bridge over a canyon. Marty could feel his pulse in his temples. That's great news. Congratulations." "Thanks. She's marrying a good guy, a teacher. They're really happy." David paused, and Marty could hear something in the background, maybe a dog barking or a door closing. "Look, I know things have been strange between us. I know it's been my fault as much as yours. But life's short, Marty." And Emma asked about her uncle. "She barely remembers you. I'd like to change that." Marty wanted to say yes. Some part of him, buried deep under years of pride and stubbornness, wanted to say yes so badly it hurt. But another part, the part that had been proving itself right for decades, couldn't let it go. "How's the house?" he asked instead. "The one you bought with your half of the land?" David was quiet for a moment. "It's good. It's been a good house. We've been happy here." "I'm glad," Marty said, and he meant it, but it came out wrong, edged with something bitter. "Because that land I kept? It's worth 8 times what you sold it for now. I've got developers calling every week. Could have been yours too, if you'd listened." The silence that followed was different this time. Colder. "I've gotta go," David said softly. "The wedding's on the 23rd. 2 o'clock at St. Mary's. Hope to see you there." The line went dead before Marty could respond. He sat there for a long time, holding the phone, staring at nothing. Patricia found him like that when she came to ask about dinner. "Who was that?" she asked. "My brother," Marty said. "His daughter's getting married." Patricia's face lit up. "Oh, that's wonderful. Are we going?" Marty set the phone down carefully, like it might break. "I don't know yet. I'll think about it." But he didn't go. When the 23rd came around, Marty told Patricia he had an important meeting with investors, a deal that couldn't wait. She went alone, drove the 35 minutes to Cedar Ridge by herself, and sat in the back of the church watching a niece she barely knew marry a man she'd never met. David saw her come in, nodded once with something that might have been understanding or might have been disappointment, and didn't ask about Marty. Not then, not at the reception, not ever again. The collapse, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable, the way a tree falls after years of rot eating at its core. The 2008 financial crisis hit Marty's world like a wrecking ball. The commercial real estate market cratered, developers vanished overnight, and the loans that had seemed manageable suddenly became impossible. The banks started calling, polite at first, then insistent, then threatening. The land that was supposed to make Marty rich sat empty and worthless, generating nothing but tax bills and interest payments. He tried to sell, finally, desperately. But no one was buying. The market was flooded with properties, everyone trying to unload their holdings before they drowned. The offers he did get were insulting, a fraction of what he turned down years before, less even than what David had accepted back in 1988. Marty would sit in his office late at night, calculator in hand, running the numbers over and over, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. The math was simple and brutal. He was underwater, drowning in debt, with no shore in sight. Patricia found out when the bank came to foreclose on their house. She'd been at the grocery store and came home to find legal notices taped to the front door, official and cold and undeniable. She called Marty's office, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. "What's happening?" she asked when he finally picked up. Why are there foreclosure notices on our house? And Marty, who'd spent his entire life having answers, who prided himself on always being the smartest person in the room, had nothing to say. Just silence and shame and the sound of his wife crying on the other end of the line. They lost the house in March. Packed 23 years of marriage into boxes and storage units. Watched strangers walk through rooms where they'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and quiet Sunday mornings. Patricia moved in with her sister in Columbus and said she needed space to think, to figure out what came next. She didn't ask Marty to come with her. He didn't offer. They both understood that some things break so completely that trying to hold the pieces together only cuts your hands. Marty rented a studio apartment above a dry cleaner on the east side of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors' arguments, and the heat only worked intermittently. He'd lie awake at night on a mattress that wasn't his, listening to the rhythmic hiss and clank of the pressing machines below, and wonder how he'd gotten here. How a man who'd graduated top of his class, who'd built a successful business, who'd been so certain about everything, could end up with nothing but a folding chair and a microwave that only heated things on one side. His consulting firm dissolved quietly, clients evaporating like morning dew. Word gets around in business circles when a man can't pay his debts, when his projections turn to dust, when the golden touch becomes a curse. The phone stopped ringing. The emails dried up. The invitations to golf outings and charity dinners stopped coming. Marty discovered what every fallen man eventually learns: that respect is rented, not owned, and the lease expires the moment you can't pay. He got a job at H&R Block preparing tax returns. Seasonal work, minimum wage plus commission, sitting in a cubicle helping people organize receipts and maximize deductions. The irony wasn't lost on him. His father had been an accountant, had started with nothing, and had built something solid and respectable. Marty had taken that foundation and reached for more, always more, and now here he was, right back where his father started, except 40 years older and with nothing to show for the journey. He still wouldn't call David. Even now, even after losing everything, that door remained closed, locked from the inside by pride that had hardened into something closer to scar tissue. Patricia called him once from her sister's house, her voice small and tired. "Have you talked to your brother?" she asked. "No," Marty said. "Why would I?" "Because he's family. Because you need family right now. Because I'm tired of watching you carry this thing around like a boulder on your back." She paused, and he could hear her sister's kids playing in the background, the sound of a normal life continuing while his stood still. "I ran into Sarah at the mall last week. She asked about you. She said David asks about you too. They're worried." "They shouldn't be," Marty said, his voice harder than he meant it to be. "I'm fine. I'll figure this out." But Patricia had learned to hear the lies underneath his words. "You're not fine, Marty. You haven't been fine for a long time. And I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore." The silence stretched between them, full of things either of them knew how to say. "I think," she said finally, carefully, "I think maybe we need to make this separation permanent. I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't live in the wreckage of your choices anymore." The divorce papers arrived in May, sandwiched between a credit card offer and a past due notice from the storage facility. Marty signed them sitting at the small table in his studio apartment, the pen shaking in his hand, his signature barely legible. 23 years of marriage, gone with the stroke of a pen. He wondered if this was what David had felt like that day in the diner, watching something precious slip away because of words that couldn't be unsaid, because of pride that couldn't bend. He sold the land finally, what was left of it after the bank took their share. Got $32,000, less than half of what David had received 20 years earlier. Less than a quarter of what he'd projected it would be worth. The check sat on his table for 3 days before he could bring himself to deposit it. It felt like admitting defeat, like signing a confession that said, "I was wrong about everything." The years that followed were gray and shapeless, days that blended into weeks that blended into seasons without distinction. Marty worked his job at H&R Block during tax season and picked up hours at a copy center the rest of the year. He lived small, bought generic brands, cut his own hair, and learned to make a chicken last for 5 meals. He paid down his debts slowly, incrementally, watching the balances decrease with the patience of a man serving a sentence he'd given himself. He'd see Patricia sometimes, across the parking lot at Target, or through the window of a restaurant where she was having lunch with friends. She'd remarried, he'd heard, to a man who taught high school history, a quiet guy who wore sweater vests and drove a sensible sedan. Good for her, Marty thought, and meant it. She deserved better than what he'd given her. Better than the anxiety and the broken promises, and the slow realization that she'd married a man who loved being right more than he loved anything else. He thought about David often, especially on holidays and birthdays, on the anniversary of their father's death. He'd draft emails sometimes, long rambling messages that tried to explain or apologize or justify, but he never sent them. What was there to say? You were right, and I was wrong. It felt too simple and too devastating. I'm sorry you felt inadequate for the years of silence and separation. So he said nothing, and the silence grew longer, and the distance became something you could measure in more than miles. His health started to fail in small, insidious ways. High blood pressure, the doctor said, and prediabetes, and you really should lose some weight, Mr. Caldwell. There were pills for the blood pressure, warnings about the diabetes, and suggestions about diet and exercise that Marty nodded at and mostly ignored. He felt older than his years, worn down by carrying the weight of his mistakes, by waking up every day in a life he'd built from bad decisions and stubbornness. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, forwarded from 3 previous addresses before finding him in his studio apartment. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky but familiar, and for a moment Marty's heart jumped before he realized it wasn't David's writing. It was Emma's, his niece, the little girl he'd last seen in a photograph when she was 3 years old. She was 32 now, married, and a mother herself. Time keeps moving whether you're paying attention or not. He opened it standing by the window, afternoon light slanting across the page. Dear Uncle Marty, it began, and something in his chest tightened. I hope this letter finds you well. I'm not sure if Dad told you, but he had a stroke last month. He's recovering. The doctors say he'll be okay, but it shook us all pretty badly. It made me think about family, about time, and about all the things we leave unsaid because we think we'll have forever to say them. Marty had to sit down. David had a stroke. His brother, his only brother, the person who'd once known him better than anyone, had nearly died, and Marty hadn't even known. Hadn't been there, hadn't called, hadn't sent flowers or cards or anything at all. The guilt hit him like a wave, cold and suffocating. The letter continued. Dad talks about you sometimes, especially lately. He'll mention something about growing up, about your father, and about the 2 of you as kids. He doesn't say much, but I can tell he misses you. He never says it outright. That's not his way, but a daughter knows. Mom says you 2 had a falling out years ago, something about land and money, but honestly, Uncle Marty, does any of that really matter anymore? Life's too short to stay angry at the people we love. She'd included her phone number at the bottom, a small invitation, and a door left unlocked. If you ever want to talk or visit, or just say hello, I'd love to hear from you. Dad would too, even if he won't admit it. We're not promised tomorrow. I learned that the hard way last month. Please think about it. Love, Emma. Marty read the letter 7 times that day, memorizing the words, hearing Emma's voice in the sentences even though he couldn't remember what her voice sounded like. He kept the letter on his table, picking it up every time he walked past, as if the answer to what he should do might reveal itself through repetition. But all he felt was the weight of everything he'd lost, everything he'd sacrificed on the altar of being right. He could go to David. He could call, or write, or just show up at the house on Elm Street and knock on the door like he should have done a decade ago. He could say, I'm sorry, and I was wrong, and I've wasted so much time. He could meet his niece properly and meet her children, his great-nieces or great-nephews whose names he didn't even know. He could try to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship, build something small and fragile that might grow stronger with time. But to do that, he'd have to admit the truth. Not just to David, but to himself. He'd have to look at the last 20 years and acknowledge that he'd traded everything that mattered for the satisfaction of being right. He'd lost his wife, his home, and his relationship with his only brother, all to prove a point that no one cared about anymore. The land was sold, the money was spent, and the victory was hollow. And for what? So he could say, "See, I told you so?" He walked to the liquor store that evening, bought a bottle of whiskey that cost more than he usually spent on a week's groceries, and sat in his apartment drinking it slowly and methodically, trying to drown the voice in his head that said he'd become everything he'd feared. His father used to say, "It's not whether you win or lose, it's whether you become someone you can live with along the way." Marty had spent his whole life trying to win, and in the process, he'd become someone he could barely stand to look at in the mirror. The bottle was half empty when he picked up his phone, Emma's number pulled up on the screen, his thumb hovering over the call button. It would be easy, so easy, to just press it. To hear a voice on the other end say, "This is your Uncle Marty," and let whatever happened next happen. But his thumb wouldn't move. The pride that had shaped his entire life held him frozen, unable to reach across the distance he'd created. He didn't call that night, or the next day, or the day after that. The letter stayed on his table, a silent accusation, a reminder of the choice he kept failing to make. He went to work, came home, ate meals that tasted like cardboard, slept fitfully, and woke up exhausted. The routine of his small life continued, but something had shifted. Emma's words had planted a seed of doubt, or maybe awareness, that wouldn't stop growing. Does any of that really matter anymore? That's what she'd asked? And the honest answer, the answer Marty could finally admit to himself at 3 in the morning when the pressing machines downstairs had finally gone quiet, was no. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The land, the money, who was right, who was wrong, none of it was worth what he'd paid. He'd been so focused on proving his point that he'd missed the entire point of living. He started seeing a therapist in November, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Chen who had an office above a coffee shop downtown. It was Patricia's suggestion, relayed through his lawyer during the final property settlement. "She thinks you should talk to someone," the lawyer had said, awkward and uncomfortable with the personal nature of the message. "She wants you to be okay." Even after everything, Patricia still cared enough to worry. The thought made Marty's eyes burn. Dr. Chen listened to his story without judgment, asking questions that peeled back layers he didn't know he had. "What were you really trying to prove?" she asked him one session. "That you were smart? That you were valuable? That you mattered?" Marty sat there, looking at the abstract painting on her wall, a swirl of blues and grays that reminded him of water or sky or something formless and changing. "I think," he said slowly, "I was trying to prove I was worth loving. That if I were successful enough, right enough, and smart enough, people would see my value." "And did it work?" Dr. Chen asked gently. Marty laughed, a sound without humor. "I lost everyone who ever loved me. So no, I'd say it didn't work." She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "The people who loved you didn't need you to prove anything, Marty. They loved you already. But you were so busy proving yourself that you forgot to let them." The session ended with Dr. Chen giving him homework, an assignment that felt impossible. "Write a letter to your brother," she said. "You don't have to send it. Just write it. Say the things you wish you'd said 20 years ago. Sometimes we need to give ourselves permission to be wrong, to be sorry, to be human." He wrote the letter over the course of a week, sitting at his small table with a legal pad and a pen that kept running out of ink. He'd start, cross out lines, crumple pages, and start again. How do you summarize 2 decades of regret in a way that doesn't sound like excuses? How do you apologize for choosing pride over love, for letting years slip away because you couldn't say 3 simple words? "I was wrong"? "Dear David," he wrote, finally, the version he didn't cross out. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if Emma will show it to you, or if it matters anymore. But I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the fight, for the silence, for every birthday and holiday and milestone I missed because I was too stubborn to pick up the phone. I'm sorry for caring more about being right than about being your brother." His hand trembled as he wrote, tears blurring his vision so he had to stop and wipe his eyes. "You were right about everything that mattered, David. Not about the land. The land doesn't matter, it never mattered. But about life, about family, about what makes a person rich. You built something beautiful, a life full of love and laughter and ordinary precious moments. I built a monument to my own ego, and when it fell, there was nothing underneath but empty pride and regrets I don't know how to carry anymore." He wrote about Patricia, about the house, and about waking up one day and realizing he'd become a stranger to himself. He wrote about seeing Emma's letter, about learning David had a stroke, and about the terror that gripped him at the thought that his brother might die without ever hearing him say he was sorry. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't think I deserve it. But if there's any part of you that remembers when we were kids, when we were brothers before we were enemies, I'd like to see you. Just once. Just to look you in the eye and tell you that losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it was entirely my fault." He signed it simply, "Your brother Marty." Then he folded it carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and addressed it to Emma. Not to David directly. That felt too presumptuous, too much like demanding attention he hadn't earned. But to Emma, with a note asking her to give it to David only if she thought it wouldn't upset him, if his health could handle it, if there was any chance he might want to hear from the brother who'd abandoned him. He mailed it on a Friday morning in December, walking 3 blocks to the post office through a light snow that was just starting to stick to the sidewalks. The woman behind the counter asked if he wanted tracking, insurance, or delivery confirmation. "No," Marty said. "Just regular mail is fine. Some things you have to send out into the world and trust they'll find their way. Some things you have to let go of and hope they don't come back empty." The waiting was terrible. Every day he'd come home and check his phone for messages that weren't there, refreshing his email looking for responses that never came. He'd lie awake at night imagining scenarios. Maybe Emma read the letter and decided her father didn't need that kind of stress. Maybe David read it and threw it away without a second thought. Maybe it arrived and sat on a table somewhere, unopened, unwanted, another piece of the past they'd all moved on from. Each possibility was its own kind of torture. Christmas came and went, a quiet affair in his studio apartment with a small tree from the drugstore and a ham sandwich for dinner. He called his old secretary, Rita, who'd worked with him for 15 years before the firm collapsed. She'd always sent him a card at the holidays, even after everything fell apart. They talked for 20 minutes about her grandchildren and her retirement, and the new hobby she'd taken up, making quilts. She didn't ask about his life. She probably could hear in his voice that there wasn't much to tell. "Take care of yourself, Marty," she said before hanging up. "You deserve to be happy." He wasn't sure he believed that anymore, but it was kind of her to say. New Year's Eve found him at the copy center, working the closing shift because holiday pay was time and a half and he needed every dollar. He watched through the storefront window as people walked by in their nice clothes, heading to parties and dinners and celebrations. Couples holding hands, families laughing together, and groups of friends already tipsy and cheerful. He thought about where he'd been a decade ago, 2 decades ago, and thought about the trajectory of a life that had somehow led him here, alone in a fluorescent-lit copy shop at midnight, listening to drunk people sing Auld Lang Syne on the street outside. Emma called on January 7th, a Sunday afternoon when Marty was doing laundry in the basement of his apartment building. He almost didn't hear his phone over the sound of the washing machines and almost let it go to voicemail. But something made him answer, some instinct or hope or fear. "Uncle Marty?" Her voice was warm and familiar, even though he'd never actually spoken to her. "It's Emma. I got your letter. We got your letter." His heart stopped. Just stopped completely for what felt like minutes but was probably only a second. "Emma," he managed. How is he?" "Your father?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that silence Marty heard everything he feared. "He's gone," she was going to say. "You waited too long, took too long to swallow your pride, and now he's gone, and you'll never have the chance to make it right." "He's okay," Emma said finally. "Better, actually. He's doing physical therapy, getting stronger every day." "He read your letter, Uncle Marty." "We all did, actually. Dad asked me to read it to him 3 times. And then he cried." Her voice got thick with emotion. "I've only seen my father cry twice in my life. Once when my mom's mother died, and once when he read your letter." Marty pressed his hand against the washing machine to steady himself, his legs suddenly unreliable. "What did he say? After he stopped crying?" Emma laughed, a sound like sunshine breaking through clouds. "He said, that stubborn idiot finally figured it out. And then he said, tell him to come home." The words hit Marty like a physical thing and knocked the breath right out of him. Come home. As if home was still a place he had access to, a door that had been left open all these years while he stood outside in the cold, too proud to knock. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Are you sure he wants to see me? Because I would understand if he didn't, if he'd rather just leave things where they are." "Uncle Marty," Emma said gently, "my father has wanted to see you every single day for the last 20 years. He was just too much like you to admit it. Too stubborn, too hurt, too convinced that the other person had to make the first move. But you made it. You took the first step. Now take the second one. Come see him. Please." Marty drove to Cedar Ridge the following Saturday in a borrowed car, a beat-up Honda Civic that his neighbor let him use in exchange for helping her move some furniture. The 35-minute drive felt like crossing continents, every mile marker a countdown to something that terrified and excited him in equal measure. He'd practiced what he would say, rehearsed a dozen different opening lines, but they all sounded inadequate, too small for the moment. The town looked the same and completely different. The diner where they'd had that terrible argument was now a nail salon. The movie theater where they'd watched Star Wars 7 times as kids had been converted into an antique mall. But the maple trees still lined Main Street, bare now in January but recognizable, eternal. The house where they'd grown up was painted a different color, blue instead of yellow, and there was a minivan in the driveway where their father's old Buick used to sit. He drove past it slowly, feeling the weight of memory, the ghost of who he'd been standing on that porch in a graduation cap, getting into his father's car for the drive to college, and coming home for Christmas with Patricia when they were newly married and everything seemed possible. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime, someone who'd believed that being smart was the same as being wise. David's house on Elm Street was modest and well-kept, with a porch swing that swayed gently in the winter breeze and a wreath still hanging on the door from Christmas. There was a wheelchair ramp now, new construction that told the story of David's stroke more clearly than words could. Marty sat in the car for 10 minutes, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor him. He could still leave, could start the car and drive away and let the letter be the final word between them. Cowardice whispered that it would be easier that way, less painful, and less risky. But then the front door opened, and Emma stepped out onto the porch. She waved, a simple gesture of welcome, and Marty realized she'd been watching for him, waiting. No turning back now. No more running from the moment he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. He got out of the car on legs that felt borrowed, walked up the path that David had probably shoveled clear of snow himself, and climbed the 3 steps to the porch where his niece stood smiling at him with tears in her eyes. "Uncle Marty," she said, and then she was hugging him, this woman he barely knew who smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, who held him like he was someone precious instead of someone who'd abandoned her family. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for being brave enough." He couldn't speak and could only nod and try not to fall apart right there on the porch. She pulled back, wiped her eyes and smiled. "He's in the living room. Mom's in there with him. They've been nervous all morning, like teenagers before a first date. It's actually kind of adorable." She led him inside, and the house enveloped him with warmth and the smell of fresh coffee and something baking in the oven. There were family photos everywhere, lining the hallway and clustered on shelves. Emma as a baby, a toddler, and a teenager. Emma in a wedding dress standing next to a man with kind eyes. Emma holding babies of her own, with David and Sarah beaming beside her as new grandparents. An entire life documented in frames, a life Marty had no part of, that had continued beautifully without him. And then he was in the living room, and there was David, sitting in a recliner by the window, thinner than Marty remembered, his left arm resting carefully in his lap in a way that suggested it didn't work quite right anymore. His hair was completely gray now, his face lined with the years they'd spent apart. But his eyes, when they met Marty's, were the same eyes that had looked up at him when they were kids, when David was 8 and Marty was 11 and the world was simpler. Either of them spoke for a long moment. They just looked at each other, and Marty saw his own regret reflected back at him, his own sorrow and relief and desperate hope that maybe, somehow, they could salvage something from the wreckage. Finally David's face crumpled, and he said, "You look like hell, Marty." And Marty laughed, a sound that was half sob, and said, "You should see the other guy." Sarah brought coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls and fussed over Marty in a way that made him feel simultaneously grateful and guilty. She'd aged well, laugh lines around her eyes, a quiet strength in the way she moved. "I'm glad you're here," she said simply, squeezing his shoulder before leaving the brothers alone. Emma had vanished too, tactful disappearances that gave them space for the conversation 2 decades overdue. "I'm sorry," Marty said, the words tumbling out before he could think better of them. "David, I'm so sorry. For everything. For the fight, for the silence, for being too stubborn and too proud to call. For missing Emma's childhood, for not being there when you had your stroke, for wasting 20 years because I couldn't admit I was wrong." His voice broke on the last word, and he had to stop and had to breathe through the tightness in his chest. David waved his good hand in a gesture that said stop, wait, hold on. "You already apologized," he said, his voice slightly slurred from the stroke but still fundamentally David's voice. "I got your letter. You don't need to do it again." He shifted in his chair, winced slightly, then met Marty's eyes directly. "I'm sorry too. I could have called. Any day in the last 20 years, I could have picked up the phone. But I didn't. I told myself I was giving you space, letting you cool down, and waiting for you to be ready. But really, I was just as stubborn as you. Just as proud." "You had nothing to be sorry for," Marty protested. "I was the one who said those terrible things at the diner. I was the one who let money come between us." David smiled, sad and knowing. "Yeah, you did. And they were terrible things, and they hurt. But Marty, you were my brother. My only brother. I should have fought harder to keep you in my life. I should have shown up at your office, or your house, or wherever you were. I should have made you listen." They sat there, the morning light streaming through the window between them, years of hurt hanging in the air like dust motes. "I lost everything," Marty said quietly. "The business, the house, Patricia. Everything I thought mattered. Everything I thought made me someone worth knowing." He looked down at his hands, rough and worn from work they weren't used to. "And the worst part is, I deserved to lose it. Because I chose it over people. Over you. The land wasn't worth anything in the end," Marty continued, the confession pouring out like poison being drained from a wound. "I held on to it, convinced myself I was being smart, strategic, and patient. Turned down offers, took out loans, mortgaged my future on being right. And when I finally sold it, I got less than you did 20 years earlier. So congratulations, little brother. You won. You were right all along." David was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the bird feeder in the yard where chickadees were fighting over sunflower seeds. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "I didn't win, Marty. And you didn't lose because the land deal went bad. You lost because you thought life was about winning." He turned to face his brother, and there was no judgment in his eyes, only sadness and understanding. "I sold my half of that land, took the money, and bought this house. And yeah, maybe I could have made more if I'd waited. But I didn't wait because I was scared of risk or because I was smarter than you. I sold it because Sarah was pregnant, and we needed a home, and that mattered more than any profit margin." He gestured around the room with his good hand, taking in the photos, the furniture worn comfortable by years of use, and the marks on the doorframe where Emma's height had been measured year by year. This is what I got for my $68,000. A place to raise my daughter. Christmases with snow falling outside while we opened presents. Birthday parties with too much cake and kids running around screaming. Quiet evenings with Sarah, watching TV and falling asleep on this couch. Emma is bringing her babies here for Sunday dinner. Marty felt tears running down his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. You got everything, he said. Everything that actually matters. David nodded slowly. Yeah. I did. But Marty, you could have had it too. You could have come to those birthday parties. You could have been Uncle Marty, who spoiled Emma rotten and taught her how to throw a baseball and walked her down the aisle when she got married. You didn't lose those things because of the land deal. You lost them because you chose to stay away. I know, Marty said, the words barely a whisper. I know that now. But at the time, I couldn't see it. All I could see was that you'd gone against my advice and made a decision I thought was stupid, and I needed to be right. I needed you to fail so I could be vindicated. How sick is that? I wanted my own brother to fail just so I could say I told you so. The admission hung in the air between them, ugly and honest. You want to know the worst part? Marty continued, voice shaking. Even after I lost everything, even after the foreclosure and the divorce and ending up in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner, I still couldn't let it go. I'd lie awake at night, running the numbers in my head, trying to figure out where it went wrong, what I could have done differently. And even then, even at my lowest point, there was this little voice in my head saying, but you were right about the potential. The projections were solid. It was just bad timing, just the market, just bad luck. He laughed bitterly. I couldn't even lose properly. Couldn't admit that being right about a business deal meant nothing if it cost me everyone I loved. Dr. Chen, my therapist, asked me once what I was really afraid of. I told her I didn't know. But I did know. I was afraid that if I wasn't right, if I wasn't the smartest person in the room, then I was nothing. That my value as a human being was tied to my ability to be correct. He looked at David, vision blurred by tears. How do you build a life on such a fragile foundation? David reached out with his good hand, and Marty met him halfway, their fingers interlocking the way they had when they were kids crossing streets, a connection that had survived everything despite Marty's best efforts to destroy it. You don't, David said simply. You can't. That's why everything fell apart. Not because you made bad business decisions, but because you tried to build a life on something that can't support it. Being right, being smart, and being successful, those things are fine. But they're not enough. They're not what makes you matter. Then what does? Marty asked, desperate for an answer that had eluded him for 58 years. David squeezed his hand gently. Love. Connection. Being present for people. Showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Forgiving yourself and others for being imperfect. Building something that lasts longer than you do. He gestured with his head toward the hallway where Emma's photos lined the walls. That's my legacy, Marty. Not a bank account or a business or being right about some land deal. It's her. It's the family we built, the love we shared, and the memories we made. That's what matters. That's what you take with you when everything else falls away. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing in a way it hadn't since they were young, before pride and competition had built walls between them. They talked about their father, about the impossible standards he'd set without meaning to, and about how Marty had internalized the message that he had to achieve to be loved. They talked about their mother, about how she died hoping her boys would reconcile, and about the guilt David carried for not trying harder. They talked about Patricia, about Sarah, about marriages and what it takes to maintain them, and about the daily choice to put someone else's needs before your ego. Emma came in eventually with sandwiches and fresh coffee, and she stayed this time, asking questions about her father's childhood, about stories David had never told her, and about the brothers they'd been before everything went wrong. Marty told her about the time David had talked him out of fighting a bully in 6th grade, how David's quiet courage had always been stronger than Marty's loud bravado. David told her about the science fair project Marty had helped him with, staying up all night to rebuild a volcano that had fallen apart, never taking credit even though it was mostly his work. They were excavating a shared history, piecing together a relationship that had been buried under years of silence. And in the telling, in the remembering, something was being rebuilt. Not the relationship they'd had. That was gone, lost to time and choices that couldn't be unmade. But something new, something fragile and precious, something worth protecting this time. Sarah joined them for dinner, a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, and they ate together around the kitchen table like a family. Marty couldn't remember the last time he'd sat at a table with people who wanted him there, who were glad for his presence instead of tolerating it. The conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating stories, comfortable silences stretching between topics. This, Marty thought. This is what I gave up. This ordinary, beautiful, priceless thing. As evening approached and Marty prepared to leave, David stopped him in the hallway. "Don't be a stranger," he said, the old phrase suddenly weighted with new meaning. "I mean it, Marty. We don't have time to waste anymore. Come back next weekend. Come back whenever you want. Your family. You're always welcome here." Marty nodded, not trusting his voice, and David pulled him into a one-armed hug that Marty returned carefully, aware of his brother's fragility and his own. "I'll be here," Marty promised. "Every weekend if you'll have me. I've got a lot of time to make up for." David pulled back and looked at him seriously. "You can't make up for lost time, Marty. It's gone. But you can make the most of the time we have left. That's all any of us can do." It was the kind of wisdom David had always possessed, the quiet understanding that Marty had dismissed as simplicity when really it was clarity. Emma walked him to his car, the winter night clear and cold, stars visible despite the streetlights. "Thank you," she said, "for coming. For writing that letter. For giving my dad his brother back. He's been lighter today than I've seen him in years. Happier." Marty shook his head. "I should be thanking you. For reaching out, for not giving up on me, for giving me a chance I didn't deserve." "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right," Emma said firmly. "Everyone deserves forgiveness, especially from family." She hugged him again, and Marty held on maybe a second longer than necessary to this niece who'd been more gracious to him than he'd earned. "Drive safe, Uncle Marty. See you next weekend." And as he drove away, watching the house get smaller in his rearview mirror, warm lights spilling from its windows into the dark street, Marty felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope. The fragile, terrifying, wonderful possibility that it wasn't too late to build something worth having. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Every Saturday, Marty would make the drive to Cedar Ridge, and would spend the day with David and Sarah and whatever family members happened to be visiting. He got to know Emma's husband, Tom, a man with endless patience and a dry wit. He met Emma's children, his great-niece Lily and great-nephew Jack, who called him Uncle Marty without any of the history attached to the name. To them, he was just Uncle Marty, the man who showed up every weekend with cookies from the bakery on Main Street and terrible jokes that made them groan. He helped David with physical therapy exercises, spotting him as he worked to regain strength in his left side. They'd work in comfortable silence, David grimacing through repetitions while Marty counted them out, and it felt like penance and healing wrapped together. Some days David's progress was visible, miraculous. Other days he struggled with tasks that should have been simple, and Marty could see the frustration in his brother's face, the fear that he'd never fully recover. "It doesn't matter," Marty told him one afternoon when David was particularly discouraged. "Whatever you get back, we'll work with it. You're still here. That's what matters." And David had looked at him with something like surprise, as if he'd heard an echo of the brother he remembered, the one who'd existed before pride and competition had poisoned everything. "When did you get wise?" David asked with a half-smile. "Had to lose everything first," Marty replied. "Wisdom's expensive." Marty started making changes in his own life, small shifts that added up to something bigger. He found a better apartment, nothing fancy but clean and quiet, with a window that got morning sun. He got promoted at the copy center and became assistant manager, which came with a small raise and actual benefits. He started going to Dr. Chen twice a month instead of weekly, progress that she celebrated as a milestone. He even went on a date, a setup by Rita, who insisted he needed to get back out there, though nothing came of it except a pleasant evening and the realization that maybe, someday, he could try again. Spring arrived with the patience of something that knows it can't be rushed, snowmelt giving way to crocuses and daffodils, and bare branches suddenly wrapped in green. Marty stood in David's backyard on a Sunday afternoon in April, watching Jack chase Lily around the garden while David supervised from a lawn chair, a blanket across his lap despite the warmth. David's recovery had plateaued somewhat, his left arm still weak, his gait still unsteady, but he'd accepted it with a grace that Marty envied. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd never sent that letter?" Marty asked, settling into the chair beside his brother. David was quiet for a moment, watching his grandchildren play, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. "I try not to think like that," he said finally. "What ifs are poison? They'll eat you alive if you let them." He glanced at Marty with a gentle smile. "But yeah, I think about it. I think we would have died strangers. I would have had my stroke, eventually passed away, and you would have read about it in the obituaries. Maybe come to the funeral, maybe not. And we both would have lost something precious without ever getting it back." The thought settled heavy between them, the weight of a future that almost happened. "Dr. Chen says I'm still working through guilt," Marty said. "That I need to forgive myself the way you forgave me. But I don't know how to do that." "How do you forgive yourself for wasting 20 years? David shifted in his chair, winced slightly, then met Marty's eyes. "You don't forgive the waste. You acknowledge it, you learn from it, and then you make sure you don't waste whatever time you have left. That's how you honor the years you lost. Not by beating yourself up, but by being present for the years you still have." It was such a David answer, practical and wise and completely without judgment. Marty wondered how his brother had learned to live like this, without the need to punish himself or others, without keeping score. "I'm trying," Marty said. "I'm really trying to be different. To care about the right things." David reached over with his good hand and patted Marty's knee. "I know you are. I can see it. Everyone can see it. Now you just need to see it yourself." Emma appeared at the back door holding something in her hands, and when she came closer, Marty saw it was an old photograph, the edges worn, the colors slightly faded. "I found this in some boxes Mom asked me to sort through," she said, handing it to David. "Thought you might want to see it." David took it carefully, and his face softened in a way that made him look 20 years younger. "My God," he whispered. "I forgot this existed." He turned it so Marty could see, and there they were. Two boys in matching polo shirts, standing in front of a birthday cake, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of children who believe they'll be friends forever. Marty must have been 14, David 11, both of them on the cusp of adolescence, still innocent of the ways pride and ego could poison love. "Dad took this," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "My birthday. You'd helped me build that model rocket, the one that actually flew. We launched it that afternoon and watched it disappear into the sky." He traced his finger along the edge of the photo, over the faces of boys who'd had no idea what was coming. "I was so proud of that rocket. But I was more proud that my big brother had helped me build it. That you thought I was worth spending time with." Marty felt something crack open in his chest, a grief he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "I was always proud of you," he said roughly. "Even when I was being a jealous ass, even when I was competing with you over nothing, I was proud. You were everything I wasn't. Easy with people, comfortable in your own skin, content with enough instead of always reaching for more. I envied that. And instead of learning from it, I resented it. We were kids," David said softly, still looking at the photograph. "Kids trying to figure out who we were and how to be in the world. We made mistakes. I made mistakes too, Marty. I let you feel like you had to compete for Dad's attention. I could have told you that I didn't need his approval the way you did, that it didn't matter to me. But I didn't. I just let you carry that burden alone." He looked up, meeting Marty's eyes. "I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I didn't see what you needed. They sat there together, the photograph resting between them, a bridge across decades of hurt. Emma had retreated back inside, giving them space, and Sarah had taken the kids for a walk around the block. It was just the two brothers, the spring afternoon, and the weight of everything they'd survived. Can I tell you something? Marty asked quietly. Something I've never told anyone? David nodded, his full attention on his brother in that way he had, like whatever you were about to say was the most important thing in the world. Marty took a breath, steadying himself. When Dad died, my first thought wasn't sadness. It was relief. Relief that I'd finally proven myself to him before he was gone. That I'd gotten into Cornell, had the scholarship, and had made him proud. And then, almost immediately, it was terror. Terror that without him there to impress, I'd lose my purpose. That I'd spend my whole life trying to be worthy in his eyes, and now those eyes were closed forever. He rubbed his face with both hands, exhausted by the confession. I think that's when it really started, the need to be right about everything. If I couldn't prove my worth to Dad anymore, I'd prove it to everyone else. To you, to Patricia, to clients and colleagues, and to anyone who'd listen. I'd be so successful, so right about everything, that no one could question my value. But you can't build a life on trying to prove something that should just be inherent. You can't earn the right to exist. David was quiet for a long time, processing, thinking. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Dad loved you, Marty. He loved both of us, in his way. But he was a product of his generation, of his own father, who'd been even harder on him. He showed love through expectations and pride in achievement because that's all he knew. He didn't know how to say, I love you just because you're mine. But that doesn't mean he didn't feel it. I know, Marty said. Intellectually, I know that. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. And I spent so much of my life trying to earn something I already had, and in the process, I lost things that actually mattered. He looked at the photograph again, at those two boys who had no idea what the future held. If I could go back and tell him one thing, he said, pointing at his younger self, I'd tell him that being loved doesn't require a resume. That he's enough, just as he is. The following weekend, Marty arrived at David's house to find an unfamiliar car in the driveway. His stomach dropped when he recognized it, though it took a moment to place. Patricia's car, or a newer version of it. The same modest sedan, the same careful parking job. For a wild second, he considered turning around and coming back another day, but Emma was already at the door, waving him in with an encouraging smile that said, It's okay, don't panic. Patricia was in the kitchen with Sarah, the two of them laughing over something, comfortable together in a way that spoke of maintained friendship despite the divorce. She turned when Marty entered, and time did that strange thing where it contracts and expands simultaneously. She looked good and happy, her hair shorter than he remembered, her face relaxed in a way it never had been during their last years together. Marty, she said, not quite warm but not cold either. It's good to see you. Patricia. His voice came out steadier than he felt. I didn't know you'd be here. I can come back another time if this is weird. She shook her head and glanced at Sarah, who gave her a nod of encouragement. Actually, I asked Emma if I could be here today. I wanted to talk to you. If that's okay. The words talk to you sent a small spike of anxiety through his chest, but he nodded. Of course. Yeah. That's fine. They ended up on the porch, the same porch where he'd stood months ago, terrified to go inside and face his brother. Patricia sat in the swing, and Marty took the chair, maintaining a respectful distance. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts, and Marty waited, patient in a way he'd never been during their marriage. I heard you've been coming here every weekend, she said finally. That you and David are rebuilding your relationship. We're trying, Marty said. It's slow, and there's a lot to work through, but yeah. We're trying. Patricia nodded, looking out at the street where a neighbor was mowing their lawn. I'm glad. Really glad. You needed that. You needed him. She turned to face Marty then, and he saw something in her eyes he couldn't quite read. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for how things ended between us. For leaving when you were at your lowest. I've carried guilt about that. Marty sat forward, elbows on his knees, struggling with how to respond. Patricia, you have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. I destroyed our marriage. I chose pride and money and being right over you, over us. You leaving was self-preservation. It was the smart thing to do. She smiled sadly. Maybe. But I still wonder sometimes if I could have stayed and could have helped you see what was happening before it all fell apart. If I'd been stronger, more patient. No, Marty interrupted firmly. Don't do that. Don't take responsibility for my failures. I see it now, what Dr. Chen's been trying to teach me. I spent our entire marriage asking you to pay the cost of my insecurities. Every time I needed to prove I was right, every time I prioritized success over our relationship, I was asking you to carry a burden that wasn't yours. You gave me 23 years, Patricia? 23 years of trying to love someone who was too busy proving himself to accept love. You don't know me guilt on top of that. Tears welled in Patricia's eyes, and she wiped them away quickly. I did love you, you know. Very much. I just couldn't watch you destroy yourself anymore. It was like watching someone drown and refusing the life preserver because they were too proud to admit they needed help. She took a shaky breath. I'm happy now. Robert's a good man, a steady man. But sometimes I still think about who you were when we first met. The young man who was ambitious but also kind, who had dreams but also heart. I miss that version of you. He's gone, Marty said honestly. That version of me got lost somewhere along the way. But maybe there's a new version emerging. Someone who's learned some hard lessons, who knows what matters now. Someone who's trying to be better, even if he can't undo the past. He met her eyes, wanting her to see the truth there. You deserve better than what I gave you, Patricia. You deserved a partner who showed up, who put you first, who valued your happiness as much as his own ego. I'm sorry I wasn't that person. I'm sorry I wasted the gift of your love. Patricia stood then, came over to where Marty sat, and did something unexpected. She hugged him. Not a romantic gesture, nothing that suggested she wanted him back, but a hug that said, I see you, I forgive you, I hope you find peace. He hugged her back carefully, grateful for the grace she was showing him, for the closure they both needed. Be good to yourself, she whispered. Stop punishing yourself for being human. We all make mistakes. The trick is learning from them. Summer arrived with the insistent heat of June, transforming David's backyard into a riot of color. Sarah's garden had exploded with tomatoes and zucchini and flowers that attracted butterflies and bees. They had a family barbecue, the whole extended clan gathering for Jack's birthday, and Marty found himself manning the grill, spatula in hand, supervising hamburgers and hot dogs while children ran through sprinklers and adults sat in lawn chairs talking and laughing. This was what he missed. Not just specific events, but the whole texture of family life, the ordinary magic of people choosing to spend time together for no reason other than they loved each other. Emma's husband Tom was teaching Jack how to throw a football. David was holding his infant granddaughter, Sarah, and Patricia's daughter from her second marriage, the complicated web of family that forms when people are gracious enough to stay connected despite divorce. Sarah and Patricia were comparing recipes, and Emma was taking photos with the kind of focused determination that said these moments mattered, that she was archiving happiness for future days when they'd need to remember. Marty felt David come up beside him, steady now on his feet though he still used a cane on bad days. Pretty good spread, David said, eyeing the grill. You always were better at cooking meat than I was. Marty smiled. One of my few practical skills. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the family they'd almost lost to pride and stubbornness. Thank you, Marty said quietly. For giving me this. For letting me be part of it again. You're not part of it, David corrected gently. You are it. Your family, Marty. Always were, even when we weren't talking. Even when we were both too stubborn to reach out. The connection doesn't break just because we stop nurturing it. It just goes dormant, waiting for someone to be brave enough to water it again. He clapped Marty on the shoulder with his good hand. "You were brave enough. That's all that matters." Emma called them over for the cake, a chocolate monstrosity covered in dinosaurs because Jack was deep in a prehistoric phase. They sang happy birthday, off-key and enthusiastic, and Jack blew out his candles with the fierce determination of a 6-year-old making a wish he believed would come true. Marty found himself singing louder than necessary, feeling something warm and expansive in his chest, something that felt suspiciously like joy. Real joy, not the hollow satisfaction of being right or successful, but the deep contentment of being present, of being connected, of being home. That evening, after the guests had left, and the cleanup was done, Marty and David sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. Sarah had gone inside to put leftovers away, and the brothers had fallen into the easy quiet that comes when you don't need to fill every silence with words. Finally, Marty spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately. About what he would think of all this." "He'd be glad," David said without hesitation. "Glad we figured it out before it was too late. Glad we got past our stubbornness." He rocked gently in the swing, the chains creaking softly. "But you know what? I don't think he'd be surprised we fought in the first place. He saw it, the competition between us, the way you felt like you had to prove something. He mentioned it once, near the end, and said he worried that he'd pushed you too hard and expected too much." Marty felt a lump form in his throat. "He said that?" David nodded. "He said he was proud of both of us, but that he was afraid his pride in your achievements had made you think achievement was all that mattered. That he should have told you more often that he loved you just for being his son, not for what you accomplished." Marty had to look away, blinking hard against the tears that threatened. "I wish he'd told me that. It might have changed everything." "Maybe," David said. "Or maybe you needed to learn it the hard way. Maybe we all need to crash and burn before we understand what really matters. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to say how life works. But I know this, you learned it. Eventually, painfully, you learned it. And you're here now. That's what counts." He paused, then added softly, "Dad would be proud of you for that, you know. For having the courage to admit you were wrong, to apologize, and to rebuild. That takes more strength than being right ever did." The words settled over Marty like a benediction, a forgiveness from beyond the grave. He'd spent 30 years trying to prove himself to a man who'd been in the ground for 25 of them, and maybe, finally, he could let that burden down. Maybe he could accept that he'd been worthy all along, that the love he'd been chasing had been there from the beginning, hidden under expectations and unexpressed emotions, but real nonetheless. The weeks turned into months, and the months accumulated into a year of weekends, of phone calls during the week, of becoming part of each other's lives again. Marty's second anniversary of reconciliation with David passed quietly, marked by a simple dinner at the house on Elm Street, where this whole journey had led him. He sat at the table, looking around at the faces he'd come to know and love, and felt the weight of everything he'd almost lost. David's health had stabilized, his recovery as complete as it was likely to get. He still struggled with his left side and still got tired more easily than before the stroke, but he'd adapted and found his new normal. Marty marveled at his brother's resilience, his refusal to mourn what he'd lost instead of celebrating what remained. It was such a David quality, that ability to find gratitude in difficulty, to see possibility instead of limitation. They were cleaning up after dinner when David asked, "Do you ever regret it? Reaching out, I mean. Coming back into all this messy family life?" Marty looked at him, surprised by the question. "Regret it? David, this is the best thing I've ever done. The only thing I've done in the last 20 years that actually matters." He dried a plate carefully, choosing his words. "I regret the 20 years I lost. I regret the pain I caused, the relationships I damaged, and the time I wasted. But reaching out? Coming back? That's the first thing I've gotten right in decades." David smiled, that warm, familiar smile that made him look like the kid in the photograph. "Good. Because we'd miss you if you stopped coming around. The kids would riot. Sarah would hunt you down. And I'd have to finish these crossword puzzles by myself. It was such a small thing, so ordinary, but Marty felt his eyes sting with gratitude. To be needed, not for what he could provide or prove, but just for being himself. To be missed if he wasn't there. That was worth more than any land deal, any business success, or any validation he'd ever chased. That night, in his apartment that felt less lonely now that he had somewhere to go on weekends, Marty pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not to anyone else this time, but to himself. To the man he'd been, and the man he was becoming, and the man he hoped to be. Dear Marty, he wrote. You lost everything trying to prove you were right. Your marriage, your home, your business, your relationship with your brother. You spent 20 years in exile because you couldn't say two simple words, I'm sorry. But here's what you gained in the losing. You gained perspective. You gained humility. You gained the ability to see past your own ego to what really matters. You gained your brother back, and a niece who calls you family, and children who know your name and light up when you arrive. You gained the understanding that being wrong isn't the worst thing in the world. Being alone is. He paused, pen hovering over paper, thinking about the journey from that argument in the diner to this moment, sitting in a quiet apartment with a heart full of gratitude instead of pride. You learn that love doesn't keep score. That family forgives. That it's never too late to change course, to admit mistakes, to ask for another chance. You learn that the things you were so certain about, the hills you were willing to die on, were just molehills. The real mountains were the ones you climbed together with people you loved. You're 59 years old now, starting over with less money and status than most people your age, but richer in the ways that count. You have Saturday dinners and phone calls and inside jokes and photographs that will outlive you. You have people who know your story and love you anyway. You have a brother who forgives you and a family who welcomes you and a second chance you didn't deserve but received anyway. Here's what you need to remember, what you need to carry with you every day. Being right means nothing if you're alone. Being successful means nothing if there's no one to share it with. Being the smartest person in the room means nothing if the room is empty. You were so afraid of being wrong, of being seen as less than, that you chose isolation over connection. And that was the wrongest thing you ever could have done. He thought about Patricia, about the gentle way she'd hugged him, releasing them both from the prison of their failed marriage. He thought about Emma, who'd reached out to a stranger and given him back his family. He thought about David, who'd read his letter and cried and said, "Come home." How many people get that? How many people get a second chance after throwing away the first one so completely? The irony, he continued writing, is that in losing everything, you found what you were looking for all along. You wanted to matter, to be valued, to know that your life meant something. But you were looking in all the wrong places. Your value wasn't in being right about a land deal or successful in business or smarter than your brother. Your value was inherent, built into the fact that you were someone's son, someone's brother, and someone's husband. You just couldn't see it under all the noise of your own insecurity. So here's the lesson you paid dearly to learn: pride is expensive. Being right is overrated. Family is everything. Love is the only investment that appreciates over time. And it's never, ever too late to apologize, to change, to become the person you should have been all along. He set down the pen, reading over what he'd written, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, not yet, but something close. Inside, she made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt completely at peace with the empty chair across from her. It wasn't Thomas's chair anymore. It was just a chair, ready for whoever needed it next. Ready for Catherine. For Eleanor. For baby Margaret Rose when she was old enough to sit at big girl tables. Ready for life. For continuing. For the next chapter. Margaret raised her teacup to the empty chair. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. For 43 years. For teaching me how to love. For showing me that love doesn't end. It just changes form. I'm going to be okay. You don't have to worry about me anymore." The house settled around her. Quiet. Peaceful. Home. And Margaret realized, this was the conversation. The important thing Thomas had wanted to tell her. Not in that moment. Not at that dinner, but in every moment. Every dinner. Every morning and evening and ordinary Tuesday. I love you. You are loved. You are worth loving. And that doesn't stop. Ever. That was the message. That was always the message. And she'd been hearing it all along. She just hadn't been ready to listen. 5 years after Thomas died, Margaret hosted Thanksgiving at her house. The first time in years. Catherine helped cook. Eleanor brought wine. The neighbors came. The house was full of people and noise and laughter and life. Margaret set the table. Counted heads. Made sure there were enough chairs. And she set one extra place. Not at the head of the table where Thomas used to sit, but at the corner. A small setting. A child's plate and fork. For Margaret Rose, she explained when Catherine asked. Her first Thanksgiving at Grandma's house. Catherine's eyes filled. Mom. That's perfect. They ate. They talked. They told Thomas stories that made everyone laugh and some people cry. Margaret served his terrible spaghetti alongside the turkey. Everyone took some. Everyone complained about the garlic. Everyone went back for seconds. After dinner, after the dishes were done and people started heading home, Catherine stayed behind. She and Margaret sat in the living room with fresh tea, comfortable silence between them. Are you happy, Mom? Catherine asked suddenly. Margaret considered the question. Really considered it. Was she happy? Not the same happy as before. Not the uncomplicated happiness of early marriage or the deep contentment of decades together. But something else. Something earned. Yes, she said finally. Different happy. Scarred happy. But yes. I'm happy. Good. Catherine smiled. Dad would want that. He would. Margaret set down her tea. Can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone? Of course. For years, I set 2 plates at dinner. Everyone thought it was because I couldn't let your father go. Because I was frozen in grief. And maybe that was part of it. But it was my way of saying he mattered. That our life together mattered. That I wasn't going to pretend he never existed just to make other people comfortable. Catherine nodded. I understand that now. I didn't then. But I do now. The plate saved me, Margaret continued. It gave me a reason to keep going. To keep cooking. To keep living. Even if I was living in the past, at least I was living. And eventually, that was enough. Eventually, I was ready to live in the present again. When did you stop? Setting the extra plate? Margaret smiled. Honestly? I still do sometimes. When I'm feeling particularly sad. Or on special days. His birthday. Our anniversary. But most nights? 1 plate. Just mine. And that's okay. Both things can be true. I can remember him and move forward. I can love who he was and love who I'm becoming. I can honor the past and build a future. That's beautiful, Mom. It's survival, Margaret corrected gently. Dressed up as philosophy. But I'll take it. They sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening. Lights coming on in windows. Families cleaning up their own Thanksgiving dinners. Life continues in 1,000 small ways. He'd be proud of you, Catherine said. For everything. For surviving. For living. For becoming this. This? Margaret gestured at herself. A 76-year-old woman with creaky knees and too many memories? No. Catherine reached over and took her mother's hand. A woman who lost everything and chose to keep going. Who built a new life out of the ruins of the old one. Who taught her daughter that grief doesn't have to destroy you. That love is worth the pain it costs when it ends. That's what he'd be proud of. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. Good tears. Grateful tears. Healing tears. Thank you, she whispered. For not giving up on me. For letting me grieve my way. For understanding. Thank you for coming back, Catherine replied. For choosing to live. For showing me what strength really looks like. That night, Alone again in her quiet house, Margaret stood in the kitchen and looked at the single plate drying in the rack. One plate. One cup. One woman who'd survived the unsurvivable, and come out the other side scarred but whole. She thought about all the people who were grieving right now. All the empty chairs and silent houses and broken hearts wondering how to keep going when the person who made going worthwhile was gone. If she could tell them anything, it would be this. The grief doesn't end. But it changes, softens, integrates. It becomes part of your landscape instead of the only thing you can see. The rituals that save you in the beginning might need to change as you heal. And that's okay. Both things can be true. The ritual was necessary, and the ritual needed to end. Love doesn't stop when someone dies. It just has nowhere to go. So you have to find new places for it. In memory. In stories. In the way you live your life going forward. In the values they taught you. In the love you give to others because they taught you how to love. You don't have to let go to move forward. You can carry them with you. Just make sure you're carrying them in ways that help you live rather than preventing you from living. And the thing they wanted to say? The words that died with them? Maybe it was just this: I love you. You are loved. Keep living. Keep going. Honor me by being fully alive. Because that's what love does. Real love. Deep love. Love that transcends death. It doesn't demand you freeze. It asks you to grow. It doesn't want you to die with them. It wants you to live for both of you. Margaret turned off the kitchen light, walked upstairs, got ready for bed, and climbed into the middle of the mattress, taking up space, claiming her life, choosing forward. Tomorrow, she'd wake up, make coffee, tend the garden, maybe call Catherine, maybe invite Eleanor over, maybe try that new recipe she'd been thinking about, maybe just sit on the porch and watch the neighborhood wake up. Small things. Ordinary things. The building blocks of a life rebuilt from ruins. And somewhere, in the space between memory and present, in the gap where grief and love intertwined, Margaret felt Thomas's presence. Not as a ghost. Not as a voice. But as a warmth. A knowing. A sense that he'd want exactly this. Her living. Her continuing. Her keeping his place at the table, not with an empty plate, but with a heart that still knew how to love. 6 months later, Margaret was in the garden when she found it. Tucked under the rosemary bush, half buried in soil. A small wooden sign. Weathered. Old. Thomas's handwriting burned into the wood. Maggie's garden. Where love grows year after year. That afternoon, they took a walk around the neighborhood together, David leaning lightly on his cane, Marty matching his pace, with no rush to get anywhere because where they were was exactly where they needed to be. They passed the house where the bully had lived, the park where they played pickup basketball, and the corner store where they bought candy with allowance money. The geography of their childhood, preserved in brick and pavement and memory. You know what I think? David said as they rounded the corner back toward his house. I think you were always going to end up here, one way or another. Maybe it had to hurt first. Maybe you had to lose things to understand what you had. But I think you were always going to find your way back. Marty wanted to believe that, wanted to think that all the pain and loss had been leading somewhere, that there was a design to it instead of just waste. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I just got lucky that you were willing to forgive me. David smiled and shook his head. Not luck. Grace. The grace we give each other when we remember that we're all just humans, doing our best, making mistakes, and trying to find our way home. They climbed the porch steps together, brothers by blood and choice, connected by history and hurt and healing. And Marty thought that if he could go back and tell his younger self one thing, it would be this: being right is cold comfort on lonely nights. But being loved, being forgiven, being part of something bigger than yourself? That's the only victory that matters. In the end, Martin Caldwell learned what we all must learn eventually. You can be right about everything and still lose what matters most. Pride is the most expensive currency, and being unable to say I'm sorry costs more than any fortune you might gain. The people who love you don't need you to be perfect or right or successful. They just need you to be present, to be honest, to value the connection more than your ego. It's never too late to change course, to apologize, or to choose love over pride. But the longer you wait, the more it costs. Don't let being right cost you everything. Because in the end, the only thing you take with you is the love you gave and received, and the only thing you'll regret is the time you wasted trying to prove something that never needed proving.